Welcome back and thank you for joining us. This is the Police and Racial Profiling Part 2 and I'm Dr. Eric Hillman. As we talk about racial profiling and accusations of racial profiling, I think it'd be worth our while to look at the case of Professor Henry Louis Gates, a professor at Harvard University, and Officer James Crowley of the Cambridge, Massachusetts Police Department. This incident happened in July of 2009. Professor Gates was gone from his house, and so a neighbor called the police and said, "Hey, there's two men breaking into Professor Gates' house." Also, this was the second burglary. As a criminal justice major, you've learned that burglaries often come in pairs. The first time the burglar breaks in, he steals the TV and the stereo, and then he waits a month or so for the insurance to replace them, and then he breaks in again and steals the replacement TV and stereo. So the neighbors call the police rush to the house, and Officer Crowley is the first one to get there. He sees a black male inside. He doesn't know who it is. The neighbor said it's a burglar, so he asks Gates, who was inside his own house, for an ID. So apparently the neighbor was mistaken. Gates refused to show his ID, so that led to a conversation between Gates and Crowley, and finally Gates did show his ID. So Officer Crowley sees that it is in fact Professor Gates, and the driver's license address matches the address he's at. So Officer Crowley realizes that it's Professor Gates and everything's fine, so Crowley is going to leave. But Gates continues yelling at Crowley even as he's leaving. Crowley left the house, and Gates followed him out in the front yard and kept yelling at him, claiming that the only reason he encountered Officer Crowley was because Officer Crowley was a racist. That if Professor Gates was white, this wouldn't have happened. This is racism. This is racial profiling. Well, this is clearly not racial profiling. The officer got a call from the neighbor saying someone's breaking into his house. Officer Crowley checks to see who it is. Turns out the neighbor's wrong, so Crowley leaves. And then with Professor Gates continuing to yell at him out in the front yard, Officer Crowley finally arrested Professor Gates for disorderly conduct. Now, clearly Professor Gates is in the wrong here. However, just as a side note, I think if I had gotten that call, I would not have arrested Professor Gates in his own front yard. So Gates was arrested. He denied that he was yelling, and he claimed that he was arrested because Officer Crowley was a racist. What Officer Crowley didn't know is that Professor Gates was a good personal friend of President Obama. And President Obama got on the evening news and defended Gates and said, yes, it's not right that this officer asked Gates for his ID, etc. Well, most Americans watching the evening news sided with Officer Crowley and said, no, the president was wrong. Officer Crowley was just doing his job. Officer Crowley left when he realized it was Gates in his own house, and President Obama had no business intervening to defend his friend when the officer was just doing his job. Then the black police commissioner got on the news and said, Officer Crowley is not a racist. As a matter of fact, I chose Officer Crowley to instruct on the subject of racial profiling, to teach other officers. And by the way, when Boston Celtics star Reggie Lewis collapsed, wasn't that Officer Crowley who was giving him CPR trying to save him? Sergeant Leon Ashley was Officer Crowley's supervisor. He said no, Officer Crowley acted correctly, and it was Professor Gates who was out of control. So the Internal Affairs investigation reviewed the 911 tapes, and turns out Professor Gates was yelling at Officer Crowley, so the 911 tapes prove that Professor Gates was lying because he said he did not yell at Officer Crowley. All across the country, police officers white, black, Hispanic, all defended Crawley, saying he just did his job and he did it correctly. So then, President Obama realized he had to do some damage control. And although I disagree with President Obama defending Professor Gates and insinuating that Officer Crawley was wrong, I was very impressed with the way President Obama handled it at this point. He had what he called the beer summit. President Obama on the far right, Vice President Joe Biden on the far left, Professor Gates second from left, and Officer Crawley sitting next to the president second from right, all met at the White House and talked over the issue over some beers. And I thought this was a very intelligent move by President Obama. He invited the cameras to take a picture of it, although the cameras and the reporters were not part of the conversation itself. But this is what President Obama referred to as a teachable moment, and I agree with him. Rather than just use the criminal justice system as a determiner of who's good and who's bad and who should go to jail and who shouldn't, perhaps we can move into what we at ETBU called restorative justice, where they can be healing and there can be understanding between all parties. And that's what this became. So kudos to President Obama for taking a bad situation and correcting it. So what is racial profiling? Well, each state has their own definition, so of course we're going to look at the Texas definition found in the Code of Criminal Procedure 3.05. Racial profiling is a law enforcement initiated action based on an individual's race, ethnicity, or national origin, rather than on the individual's behavior or on information identifying the individual as having engaged in criminal activity. So first of all, it has to be law enforcement initiated. If someone walks up to a police officer and starts asking questions, that's citizen initiated, so it's not racial profiling. And it has to be based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. If it's based on someone's behavior, so if someone is doing some criminal behavior and the officer stops him, then regardless of his race, it's not racial profiling. Or on information identifying the individual as having engaged in criminal activity. And the incident at Professor Gates' house would be exactly that. The neighbor identified the individual as having engaged in criminal activity. So that wasn't racial profiling and it wasn't racism for Officer Crawley to determine the identity of the person in the house. So clearly, what Officer Crawley did was not racial profiling. Is racial profiling common or is it unusual? Well, we're going to start by looking at a New Jersey State Police training document. And the reason I chose New Jersey to start with is because the original accusations of racial profiling happened on the New Jersey Turnpike, and that finally led to studies on racial profiling. This is around 2001 to 2003. And in that time period, almost every state of the 50 states developed a law against police racial profiling. Here in the training document, it told New Jersey state troopers to focus on Colombian males, Hispanic and black males together, or Hispanic male and female posing as a couple. So here, even in a written training document, it's encouraging troopers to focus on Colombians, Hispanics, and blacks. So that would appear to be a document authorizing racial profiling. The United States Forest Service had a document that directed all their forest rangers to, quote, interrogate all Hispanics that are stopped on traffic. The assumption, of course, being that the Hispanics are more likely to be running drugs. That sounds like an official government document encouraging racial profiling. Florida, Department of Highway Safety Guidelines. Florida state troopers were advised to be suspicious of ethnic groups associated with the drug trade. Well, also it appears to authorize officers stopping people based on ethnicity. Well, if you ask most police officers, is racial profiling widespread, most police officers would say no. However, the American Civil Liberties Union disagrees. In the ACLU report on racial profiling, they said this is not just about a few bad apples. In other words, it's not just a few bad police officers, it's about the whole tree right down to the roots. The police departments, all the officers, everything, the whole tree. Well, that is a pretty hefty accusation. Can the ACLU back it up? Well, in their report, they gave several examples of racial profiling. One of them said an officer backed away from a black suspect and the officer had his hand on his gun. Therefore, that officer must be racist. Well, if someone does something that alarms me to the point where I feel like my life or safety could be in danger, yes, I might have my hand on my gun also. And it has nothing to do with the race of the suspect. It has everything to do with the behavior of the suspect. An officer stopped a black basketball star, and instead of getting him a ticket, he asked for a autograph. And so this black basketball star concluded, well, he must not have had a good reason to stop me. He probably just stopped me because I was black, because he didn't write me a ticket. Well, maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But if I stopped Michael Jordan for speeding, and I realized it was Michael Jordan, I'd be pretty tempted to ask for an autograph instead of giving him a ticket. A mixed race couple. So the couple or husband-boyfriend was one race and the girlfriend was another, was stopped for a seatbelt violation. And they thought that the only reason they were stopped because they were mixed race, because after all it was a seatbelt violation. And probably if there were two white people, they wouldn't have been stopped. Well, we have laws on seatbelt violations. If you don't wear a seatbelt, you can get a ticket regardless of your race. A black reporter was trying to get police attention, and so the black reporter drove in circles in the intersection until the police stopped him and then said, oh, look, I got stopped. It must be because I was black. And a black motorist said, my front license plate was loose. It hadn't come off. It was loose, and the officer stopped me. Since it's not illegal to have a loose bolt on your front license plate, the officer stopped me for no legal reason, therefore it must be racial profiling. Well, officers are allowed to stop people to give helpful advice, like, hey buddy, you're about to lose your front license plate, you might want to get another bolt and fasten that down. So, although it's possible any of these examples could be racial profiling, I think there's a good explanation for all of them. Were any of these examples racial profiling? I don't know. I can't see in the heart or the mind of those officers. But if there is a valid reason to stop someone, in each of these cases it seems like there was a valid reason, then it's not racial profiling. It's based on behavior, not race. Is racial profiling justified? Well, here is a quote from National Review magazine that says, a policeman who concentrates his time on young black men is going to uncover far more crimes than one who concentrates on middle-aged Asian women. Is that true? Well, we do know statistically that young black males have a higher rate of involvement in crime than middle-aged Asian women. But is it right for the police to concentrate on these young men solely because they're black? And the answer is no, you can't concentrate on someone solely because of their race. However, if you're looking for criminal behavior and you stop people because of criminal behavior, then it shouldn't surprise us that officers stop more young black males than they do middle-aged Asian women. If drug traffickers are mostly black or Hispanic, the police don't need to be racist to stop minority motorists. They simply have to be efficient in targeting drug traffickers. Well, that's a quote from the Washington Post, a very well-respected newspaper. And it's saying, if police are good at catching drug dealers, then they're going to catch more black or Hispanics because those two races are more involved in drugs. And is that true? Are those two races more involved in drugs? We're going to look at some statistics that are maybe a little bit surprising to you. Just hold that thought. Here from the International Narcotics Interdiction Association. So this is a Narcotics Officers Association. You must have been in a coma for the last 20 years if you don't know that ethnic groups control the majority of the drug trade in the United States. Is that true or not? Again, hold that thought. So when we say that we shouldn't have racial profiling, we have to ask, well, who is hurt by racial profiling? Is it drug dealers? Are they hurt by racial profiling? Yes, but the reality is, who cares? Does anyone care if drug dealers are hurt by racial profiling? Nobody really cares about drug dealers, but this is the real issue. By far the largest number of Americans angry about racial profiling are law-abiding black people who feel they are stopped and questioned because the police regard all black people with undue suspicion. And that's the real point. If only drug dealers were hurt by racial profiling, no one would really care. Who supports drug dealers? You and I don't. The problem is if police officers assume that blacks or Hispanics have drugs and therefore stop them, harass them, search their vehicles looking for drugs, then although a small percentage may have drugs, most black and Hispanics that we stop will not have drugs. They are honest, hardworking people, good American citizens, and each time the officer stops one solely because of their race, that's one more person, one more family, one more group of people that turned against the police because of that harassment. So it's the innocent, law-abiding blacks and Hispanics is the one we're worried about. Well, it's kind of interesting. We would expect that black police chiefs would be opposed to racial profiling, and for the most part they are, but I found some interesting quotes. Most minority police leaders do oppose racial profiling. This is a picture of Los Angeles Police Chief Bernard Parks. He said in an interview with the New York Times, "Racial profiling is common sense." Interesting quote from a black police chief. In Oakland, California, Captain Ronald Davis heads up Noble's effort to end racial profiling. Noble is National Organization of Blacks in Law Enforcement. So he is actually in charge of Noble's effort to end racial profiling. He says, yes, I've been a victim of racial profiling. Why? Because I'm a black man, I drive a Mercedes. White cops stop me thinking, why would a black guy be driving a Mercedes? He can't afford that. He must be stolen. But on the other hand, he admits, back when he was an officer on the street, because he's a captain now, he's an administrator, back when he was an officer, he used racial profiling. I'm not racist, said Captain Davis. At the time, you really think you're doing the right thing, as reported to the Houston Chronicle. Chief of Police Jerry Oliver is black. He was the chief of Richmond, Virginia. He says he was stopped for driving in a white community. And this is a theme that tends to repeat itself. You have a hardworking, successful black person who perhaps is able to, because of his success, move out of the ghetto, move into a decent neighborhood, and that decent neighborhood is mostly white, and then finds himself being stopped because he's a black person in a white neighborhood. But he admits, when he was a police officer on the street, he stopped whites in a black neighborhood purely because of their race, because they were white and looked out of place. So Chief Jerry Oliver practiced racial profiling against white folks. Interesting. Now, Washington, D.C. is mostly black. In the daytime, lots of white folks there in our nation's capital. However, most of them then drive to Maryland or Virginia after work because Washington, D.C. is very small and very expensive. The Washington, D.C. Police Department is also mostly black, and it has a black chief. This is a picture of Chief Ramsey on top, obviously mixed race. But he's black, and he opposed racial profiling studies, saying, hey, we got a mostly black police department, black chief, black residents, we don't need to worry about racial profiling. But then he did a study and he found some email messages from officers. One said, let's stop him, he's dating a white girl. I feel like going out and punching Whitey today. These are quotes from black police officers. So it looks like that even black police officers engage in racial profiling. So perhaps when we say racial profiling is DWB, driving while black, maybe in Washington, D.C., racial profiling is DWW, driving while white. All I'm saying is racism, racial profiling, prejudices come in all colors. No one is immune, whether you are black or Hispanic or white or Asian. Each one of us has to examine our own hearts to determine whether we engage in racism or racial profiling. What about other minority leaders, non-police leaders? In the picture, you see two candidates for senator from Illinois, Barack Obama and Alan Keyes. Now, Barack Obama ended up winning the election to be senator from Illinois and later became president. However, in this debate, Larry King interviewed Alan Keyes, the man on the right, and said, wouldn't you be angry with a police officer who pulled you over for being black? Maybe, said Alan, but I would be angry with other black people who gave me a bad reputation. So that's an interesting take on racial profiling. Isn't he then saying that the crimes of other black people is what makes white officers stop black people, including me, even though I'm not a criminal? Does that make it right? Obviously not. Officers should not be stopping people based on race. But here's Alan Keyes, a candidate for U.S. Senate, saying, you know, there's some blame to share here. And that's the end of the Police and Racial Profiling Part 2. Thank you for joining us. Once you finish this, I encourage you to continue on to Segment 3.